Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. And one of them is a tale from Kyoto, where love and death became hopelessly entangled. It begins with an American teacher named Daniel, who had recently moved to Japan to start a new life. He spent his days walking through ancient shrines and quiet neighborhoods, feeling both foreign and at home at the same time. One evening, as the lanterns glowed beneath the cherry blossom trees, he noticed her, a young woman standing silently in the shadows of a shrine. Her name was Aiko. She was graceful, reserved, and carried an air of sorrow that seemed almost too heavy for someone so delicate. From that moment, the two were inseparable. Neighbors saw them walking together at dusk, whispering as if the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. But as beautiful as their romance appeared, there was something wrong, something people whispered about behind closed doors, because when they looked closely, they noticed that Daniel always seemed to be walking alone. Daniel had always dreamed of living in Japan, drawn by its ancient temples, quiet streets, and the way the past seemed to linger in every corner. When he finally moved to Kyoto, he felt a strange thrill, a mix of excitement and unease, like stepping into a world that existed slightly out of time. The city was beautiful, but it carried an undercurrent of something he could not name. Lanterns flickered along narrow alleys, and the sound of wind through bamboo groves sometimes seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who would listen. He took a job as an English teacher at a local school, spending his days in classrooms filled with polite, curious students, and his evenings wandering the quiet streets of the city. One evening, he followed the familiar path past a centuries-old shrine, the lanterns casting long shadows across the stone steps. That was when he first saw her, Aiko. She stood beneath a blooming cherry blossom tree, pale and delicate, almost as if she had been waiting for him. Her eyes held a depth that made him pause, a quiet sadness that felt strangely familiar, though he had never met her before. They began to see each other every evening, sharing walks through the city and quiet conversations beneath the glowing lanterns. Slowly, Daniel felt drawn into a life that seemed perfect, a life far removed from the lonely routine he had left behind in America. Aiko was gentle and attentive, always anticipating his needs, her presence soothing in a way he could not explain. Yet, there were oddities that did not fit the picture of a normal romance. She never spoke of her family, never allowed mirrors in her home, and avoided sunlight as if it might harm her. Despite these strange details, Daniel's fascination with her only deepened. He found himself imagining a future together, one filled with quiet evenings in their small Kyoto apartment and secret visits to the shrine where they had met. But even as their love grew, a creeping sense of unease began to settle around him. There were nights when he would awaken to find her gone, the room colder than it should have been, the faint scent of cherry blossoms lingering in the air. Shadows seemed to stretch differently when she was near, and the soft sound of her footsteps sometimes failed to reach his ears. Daniel wanted to believe everything was normal, that this was simply a life unlike any he had ever known. But deep down, a whisper of doubt began to grow, a nagging feeling that something about Aiko, about their love, was not quite what it seemed. He could not yet understand it, but the city's quiet streets and glowing lanterns seemed to hint that he was about to discover a truth far darker than he had imagined. As the days passed, Daniel's life with Aiko settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and peculiar. They would rise together in the mornings, sharing quiet breakfasts in their small apartment, and spend the afternoons wandering Kyoto's streets, exploring the hidden alleys and centuries-old shrines. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. Yet beneath the calm, subtle signs began to gnaw at him, small details that felt almost impossible to ignore. It started with the house itself. Daniel noticed that certain objects seemed to move without explanation. A teacup would be slightly off the edge of the table. A book would be open on a page he was certain he had never turned to. At first, he dismissed it, telling himself that he must have forgotten, or that Aiko had simply tidied up while he wasn't looking. But the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Every time he looked away for a moment, something would shift, something would change. And yet when he asked Aiko about it, she would smile softly and say nothing, her eyes glinting with a quiet mischief. Then came the footsteps, or rather, the absence of them. Daniel noticed that when she walked across the wooden floors, there was no sound, no creak, no soft thud of shoes, nothing. He would sit in the next room, reading or preparing lessons, and glance up to see her standing in the doorway as if she had appeared from thin air. He began testing it, watching her from the stairwell or the kitchen, but each time she moved silently, her presence fluid and unnerving. The first night it truly unsettled him, he called out, asking if she had come in from the other room. Aiko simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and replied that she had been there all along. Neighbors, too, seemed to notice oddities, though they never spoke of them directly. Daniel overheard hushed conversations in the courtyard, voices trailing off when he approached. Aiko would wave politely, but the conversations would stop, the whispering fading into silence. He learned through fragments that some neighbors claimed they often saw him walking alone at night, as if he were speaking to himself. Daniel had no memory of these outings. When he asked Aiko, she would only tilt her head, eyes dark and unreadable, and assure him that he had been with her the whole time. The first truly disturbing moment came one evening when Daniel decided to surprise her with a photograph. He had bought a small camera, thinking it would be a nice way to capture memories of their life together. That night, he snapped a picture of them sitting beneath the cherry blossom tree where they had first met. The photo developed, and to his horror, Aiko was absent. Only he appeared, smiling at empty air, the blossoms glowing behind him as if the world had conspired to erase her presence entirely. Heart-pounding, he turned to find her standing beside him, expression calm, almost too calm. He asked, voice shaking, what had happened. She did not flinch, did not hesitate. Instead, she took his hand gently and whispered that some things were hidden, some truths waiting for the right moment. Daniel tried to laugh it off, telling himself it must be a trick of the camera or some reflection of light, but the unease settled deep into his chest. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt the cold brush of her hand against his, cold in a way that no living touch should ever feel. By the time he drifted into a restless sleep, Daniel realized something impossible. The woman he loved was not entirely as she seemed. Small clues were stacking together, each one pointing to a reality he could not yet comprehend. Aiko's devotion, her grace, her quiet presence, all were real, but a shadow of doubt had begun to creep between them, a whispering question that would not be silenced. Who was she really? And why did the world seem to bend subtly around her presence? The first signs of the unnatural had arrived, subtle but undeniable, and Daniel could feel that the ordinary world he had known was beginning to unravel. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself increasingly unsettled. The small, strange occurrences he had initially dismissed began to compound, layering a tension he could no longer ignore. Every corner of the apartment seemed to hold a whisper. Every shadow felt slightly too dark. Every breeze through the paper, sliding doors carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms, even in the dead of winter. When the trees outside were bare, one evening, He returned home after a late lesson at the school and found the apartment unusually cold. The lanterns they had lit earlier flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Aiko was there, sitting silently in the corner, her face partially hidden beneath the delicate folds of her kimono. As he approached, he noticed a strange, almost imperceptible glow surrounding her, as if the light bent around her in a way that made everything else fade. His throat tightened, but before he could speak, there was a knock at the door. It was a neighbor, a middle-aged man who Daniel had spoken to only briefly before. The man's face was pale, his expression anxious, and he spoke in hurried whispers that made Daniel lean closer. "I don't mean to alarm you," he said, eyes darting toward Aiko, "but you should be careful. She is not like the others. People have seen her wandering the shrine at night, even years ago. Some say she's been waiting." Before Daniel could ask more, the man left, leaving behind a silence that pressed against him like a physical weight. That night, Daniel tried to talk to Aiko about the warning, but she only smiled, her eyes distant. "Some truths are not meant to be spoken aloud," she murmured. Her voice was soft, melodic, but there was a coldness beneath it that made him shiver. He wanted to believe her, to trust that their love was enough to explain the unease, but the photographs, the neighbor's whispers, the impossible silence of her footsteps, they all pressed into his mind, refusing to let him forget. Then came the second strange event, one that would haunt him long after it occurred. As he walked through the shrine where they had first met, he noticed the stone markers for the fallen, centuries-old graves etched with names that seemed almost too familiar. Among them, a small, unmarked grave lay near the lanterns. A sudden gust of wind carried the faint scent of cherry blossoms, and in that moment he swore he saw Aiko standing over the grave, pale and still, her eyes fixed on the dark soil. He blinked, and she was gone. Only the wind remained, whispering in the trees, leaving him with a chill that sank deep into his bones. Daniel realized that the life he had embraced in Kyoto was no longer ordinary. Every smile, every touch, every quiet evening now carried a weight of uncertainty. The world around him seemed to warp subtly, bending reality in ways he could not explain, and yet he could not turn away. The tension grew, a storm building quietly beneath the surface, and with every passing night, Daniel felt that the truth about Aiko was drawing closer, waiting to reveal itself in ways he might not survive. One night, Daniel could no longer ignore the growing unease that had settled over his life. The apartment felt colder than usual, the shadows longer and darker, pressing against the walls like silent witnesses. Lanterns flickered weakly, their light bending unnaturally around corners, and he felt a strange pull toward the shrine where he and Aiko had first met. He could not explain why, but something inside him demanded answers, demanded to see the truth of what he had been living with. When he arrived at the shrine, the air was thick with mist, curling around the stone steps and ancient trees like fingers. The usual quiet of the night felt heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. There, beneath the cherry blossom tree, stood Aiko, pale and still, her kimono glowing faintly in the lantern light. Her hair fell like liquid shadows over her shoulders, and her eyes reflected an eternity of sorrow. Daniel stepped closer, heart hammering, and called her name. She did not move, did not blink. For a moment, it was as if she were carved from the night itself, a living shadow, neither wholly present nor entirely absent. Then the world seemed to shift. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, the cherry blossoms twisting in unnatural patterns, petals floating upward instead of falling. A soft, almost inaudible whisper carried through the mist, and Daniel realized it was her voice, but not quite. It was layered, echoing, as if countless voices were speaking through hers at once. "Daniel, you should not be here," the whisper said, trembling with grief and something else he could not name. Before he could respond, she vanished. The air seemed to shiver, and then she appeared again, closer this time, hovering just above the ground. Her eyes were filled with a desperate longing, and Daniel felt an overwhelming sadness that made him stumble backward. He wanted to reach for her, to touch her, but every time his hand drew near, she flickered like a flame in the wind, her form rippling and distorting, impossible to hold. A sudden gust of wind carried a lantern from the shrine, swinging it violently until it crashed to the ground, shattering with a sound that echoed unnaturally through the night. Daniel covered his ears, but the echoes seemed to penetrate his mind, and in that moment he understood something he had not dared to admit before. Aiko's presence was not of this world. The warmth, the devotion, the gentle hand, everything he had clung to as proof of life, was layered over something eternal, something unreachable. She was a spirit, tethered to the shrine, to the cherry blossoms, to the earth that had claimed her long before he had arrived. As the realization settled in, Aiko reached toward him one last time. Her hand brushed his cheek, icy and impossibly light, and Daniel saw the faint outline of the unmarked grave near the shrine, the soil dark and waiting. Her eyes filled with a silent apology, and for a fleeting instant, the line between love and death blurred completely. The world around him felt suspended, time hanging like a fragile thread, and Daniel understood that he had crossed into a reality where life and death were entwined in ways he could barely comprehend. In that night of mist and shadows, he finally saw her truth, and it was beautiful, tragic, and utterly terrifying all at once. The first light of dawn crept over Kyoto, softening the shadows that had seemed so oppressive the night before. Daniel sat on the stone steps of the shrine, his hands trembling, eyes fixed on the ground where the lanterns still swayed faintly in the morning breeze. The mist had thinned, leaving only the quiet scent of cherry blossoms in the air, but the weight of what he had experienced lingered like a heavy fog over his mind. He knew, deep down, that everything he had believed about Aiko, about their life together, was being rewritten before him. It was then that Aiko spoke, her voice low and almost hesitant, breaking the fragile silence. She told him the story, the one she had carried alone for decades, bound by grief and the unnatural tether of her own existence. She had died tragically during the war, a young woman whose life was stolen before it had truly begun. Buried in an unmarked grave near the shrine where they had first met, her spirit had lingered, unable to move on, caught between the worlds of the living and the dead. She had waited for someone to see her, someone whose presence could briefly fill the void of eternity with the warmth of companionship. Daniel listened, the revelation hitting him in waves, each more unbearable than the last. The photographs, the silent footsteps, the whispers from neighbors, all of it made sense. Now, Aiko had not been hiding her past. She had been hiding the boundaries she could not cross. The love he had felt, the gentle smiles, the quiet devotion, everything was real, yet layered atop a reality he could barely comprehend. She was there with him, but only partially, tethered to a world he could not enter, bound to a grief that had lasted decades. She explained that her avoidance of mirrors and sunlight was not vanity or fear, but necessity. Reflections and direct light drew her essence thin, revealing the fragility of her existence. Photographs failed to capture her, because the camera could only record what belonged fully to the world of the living. Each act of ordinary life that had seemed strange, the movement of objects, the silent steps, was the delicate interplay of a spirit attempting to exist alongside the living without breaking the fragile threads of reality. As the morning deepened, Daniel could see the truth in her eyes, the sorrow, the longing, and the impossibility of their love. He understood that while their connection had been genuine, it had always carried the weight of impossibility. The revelation did not make the fear disappear. Instead, it reframed everything he had experienced, turning unease into understanding, confusion into sorrowful clarity. Aiko had shared her story, but the world would not fully allow them to exist together. And in that quiet moment, beneath the cherry blossoms, Daniel realized that love could be real, even when it was fleeting, and that some truths, once seen, could never be unseen. As the sun rose higher over Kyoto, Aiko's form began to waver, the edges of her presence flickering like a candle in the wind. Daniel reached out instinctively, desperate to hold on to the one thing that had made this strange world feel alive, but his hands met only air. Her eyes, full of sorrow and love, met his one last time, and in them was a silent apology that no words could ever carry. "I have to go," she whispered, that faint scent of cherry blossoms drifting around him. "This is where I belong, but I will always remember you." Before he could respond, she faded completely, leaving only the faint shimmer of morning mist and the lingering aroma of the blossoms where she had stood. Daniel staggered back, heart hammering, mind racing, unable to process the sudden emptiness. The world seemed quieter, colder, and yet impossibly still, as if holding its breath in mourning. He looked around the shrine, eyes searching for any sign of her, any evidence that she had truly existed. But there was nothing, just the unmarked grave, the stone steps, and the cherry blossoms drifting gently to the ground, the photographs, the whispers, the impossibilities. They were all fragments of a reality that now felt both painfully tangible and impossibly distant. Daniel left the shrine that morning with his heart heavy, the memory of her touch and her voice etched into him forever. He could never be certain if their love had been real, or a fleeting glimpse of something beyond understanding. Yet, as he walked through the quiet streets of Kyoto, the faint scent of cherry blossoms followed him, teasing the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Had he truly loved a woman, or had he loved a ghost? And somewhere, just beyond the edge of perception, Aiko watched. After Daniel's story, the night's shadows did not seem to lift. The streets of Kyoto held more secrets than one man could face alone, and the city's quiet corners whispered of love, loss, and the restless dead. Not far from where Daniel had wandered, deep within the misty bamboo forests, another tale waited, one of beauty and sorrow, of a man drawn into a world he could not survive. Hiroshi, a traveling merchant, had encountered a widow whose grief seemed to reach out across time itself, pulling him deeper into the forest with every step. Like Daniel, he was captivated, blinded by longing, unaware that the very presence he adored carried a danger, as ancient and unforgiving as the forest shadows that hid her. Tonight, we step into that haunting story. Hiroshi was a traveling merchant, accustomed to the long roads and bustling towns of Kyoto, yet there was something about the outskirts of the city that always called to him. Beyond the streets and temples, past the markets and lantern-lit alleys, lay the bamboo forests, a place where the mist clung to the ground like a living thing, and the air smelled of damp earth and hidden secrets. Merchants like Hiroshi rarely ventured there, but whispers of travelers who had glimpsed something extraordinary, something tragic, had drawn his curiosity further than caution would allow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled into shades of violet and gray, Hiroshi followed a narrow path into the dense grove. The bamboo stalks swayed gently in the wind, though the forest was eerily silent, and every step he took seemed to echo with a presence he could not see. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, twisting with the soft glow of the moon above. It was there, amidst the mist and the rustling stalks, that he saw her a widow dressed in pure white, standing as if she had always belonged to the forest itself. Her beauty struck him immediately, but it was more than beauty. There was a sorrow etched into every delicate line of her face, a grief that seemed to seep into the very soil beneath his feet. She spoke softly, her voice like wind through the bamboo, telling him of her husband, taken too young, leaving her alone in the world. Her words hung in the air, fragile yet impossible to ignore. Hiroshi found himself drawn in, compelled by a mixture of pity, fascination, and something he could not name. Night after night, he returned to the forest, navigating the twisting paths until he reached the hidden house that seemed to shimmer between shadow and moonlight. It was a place that felt almost unreal, perched on the edge of the world between life and death, the kind of place that could vanish if one blinked. Each visit deepened his attachment, each conversation and shared smile pulling him further away from the safety of the village and closer to a mystery that was both captivating and unsettling. Hiroshi did not yet understand that the forest had its own will, that the widow's sorrow was more than it seemed, or that the longer he lingered, the more he risked losing not only his way home but himself entirely. The night air whispered promises and threats in equal measure, and the bamboo shadows waited, patient and eternal, ready to reveal the secrets of the widow and the danger that came with her ethereal allure. As Hiroshi spent more nights in the bamboo forest, he began to notice subtle oddities that unsettled him, though he could not yet put them into words. Each evening, the path leading to the widow's hidden home seemed to shift, twisting and lengthening in ways that defied memory. A turn he had taken the night before would suddenly be gone, replaced by another unfamiliar route, as if the forest itself was guiding him deeper into its heart. He felt a strange pull with every step, a mix of curiosity and unease, and yet he could not turn away. The forest seemed alive, its mist curling around him, brushing against his arms like pale fingers. The widow remained captivating, her presence both comforting and unsettling. She welcomed him into the shimmering house with gentle smiles and quiet conversation, yet there was something in her eyes that hinted at a secret he was not meant to see. On his first visit, he had been struck by the unusual stillness of her home. There were no sounds of life beyond the wind through the bamboo, no furniture creaking under weight, no hearth crackling with warmth. It was as though the very air inside moved differently, bending around her, shielding her from the ordinary world. Hiroshi attributed it to enchantment, though even that explanation seemed insufficient. One night, as he lingered in the house longer than usual, he felt a sudden weakness in his limbs. His arms grew heavy, his legs trembling, and an inexplicable chill ran through his body, as though the forest itself were siphoning his strength. The widow noticed immediately, though she said nothing, only watching him with a quiet, unreadable expression. She offered him tea, warm and fragrant, but even as he drank, the cold seemed to seep deeper, leaving a numbness that made his heart beat faster and his thoughts scatter. Then came the first true glimpse of something beyond explanation. As the moonlight spilled across the bamboo outside, Hiroshi looked toward her face and froze. Her eyes, usually soft and sorrowful, now appeared hollow, dark cavities that reflected nothing of the world around them. Her lips had taken on a faint bluish tint, and her skin seemed almost translucent, like delicate paper stretched over bone. The gentle widow he had admired was no longer entirely human, though her beauty remained a beauty that now carried a silent, terrifying promise. Hiroshi stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing as a strange dizziness overtook him. He questioned his own eyes, telling himself it must be the moonlight, the shadows, exhaustion from his travels. Yet every instinct in his body screamed that the truth was far more sinister. The house, the forest, and the widow herself all seemed to exist on the boundary between life and death, a fragile line that he had crossed without realizing it. By the time he left the forest that night, Hiroshi could feel that something was changing within him. His strength had diminished further, his skin paler than before, and a deep, creeping weariness settled into his bones. The bamboo shadows seemed to linger longer behind him, stretching unnaturally, whispering promises he did not understand. He could not yet grasp the danger he faced, but the first hints were clear. The forest and the widow were not what. They appeared, and the more he returned, the closer he came to a truth that would consume him entirely. Hiroshi could no longer deny that the bamboo forest was changing him. Each night he ventured deeper, the paths twisting and shifting as if alive, and the mist curling around his legs like cold fingers. The hidden house shimmered faintly under the moonlight, a place that seemed both welcoming and impossibly distant from the world he knew. The widow's presence was intoxicating, but there was an increasing unease he could not ignore. Her beauty remained, but the softness of her expression now carried something darker, a hunger masked beneath the sorrow. One night, as Hiroshi followed her further than ever, he felt a strange pull at his chest, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. The air was thick, almost solid, and the bamboo whispered around him in voices too faint to understand but impossible to ignore. Then he noticed the second strange event. Small objects around the house had shifted without explanation. A teacup he had placed on the table days before sat on the floor, upside down. A fan leaned against the wall as though someone or something had moved it. Even the shadows seemed wrong, stretching longer, twisting toward him as if alive, as if the forest itself were aware of his presence. Hiroshi tried to speak to the widow about these oddities, but she only smiled gently, her hollow eyes flickering in the lantern light. "There are things you cannot understand yet," she whispered. Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of warning, and Hiroshi could feel the forest tightening around him, urging him to listen, to obey, to go no further. Then, a conflicting figure appeared. An elderly woodcutter who lived at the edge of the bamboo grove approached him one evening, leaning heavily on his gnarled staff. His eyes were sharp, and when he spoke, his voice trembled with urgency. "Do not go deeper," he warned. "The forest takes what it wants. The widow, she is not what she seems. Men who follow her too far never return the same, if they return at all." He looked around nervously, as if afraid the trees themselves were listening. Hiroshi thanked him politely, but felt a pull he could not resist, the mixture of fear and fascination rooting him in place. That night, Hiroshi awoke feeling weaker than ever, the chill in his bones deep and penetrating. He glimpsed the widow beneath the moonlight, her figure flickering, almost translucent, and the weight of the forest pressing down on him. Every step closer to her seemed to drain his strength further, yet he could not stop. The warning of the woodcutter, the shifting objects, the strange whispering in the bamboo, all pointed to the same conclusion. The deeper he went, the closer he came to a truth he was not ready to face, a danger as ancient and unyielding as the forest itself. Hiroshi realized, with a growing dread, that the forest and its widow had ensnared him. Each night was a test, each step a surrender, and the line between desire and doom was thinning, ready to snap. Hiroshi could feel the forest closing in around him that night, the bamboo swaying in a rhythm that made his heart pound faster than the wind would allow. The path to the widow's house seemed endless, twisting and looping back on itself in ways that made him dizzy, disoriented. Moonlight spilled through the stalks in fractured patterns, illuminating glimpses of white fabric in the mist, as if the widow herself were flitting just beyond his vision. His legs ached, his chest burned, yet some irresistible force pulled him onward, deeper into the forest than he had ever dared to go before. When he finally reached the shimmering house, it felt both familiar and impossibly wrong. The walls seemed to ripple like liquid, the soft light of the lanterns bending unnaturally around the structure. The widow stood in the center of the room, her figure pale and luminous, hair cascading over, her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Her hollow eyes stared at him, unblinking, as though she were seeing into every secret of his mind. Her lips curved in the faintest sorrowful smile, but it was a smile that sent shivers crawling across his skin. Hiroshi stepped forward, reaching out, but the moment his fingers brushed the air where her hand should have been, he felt a cold, unlike anything he had known, seeping into his bones. The floor beneath him seemed to vanish, the walls melting into mist, and he stumbled backward, nearly falling into a pool of darkness that had appeared where the ground should have been. The widow's voice echoed through the forest, layered and ethereal, as though dozens of voices were speaking through her at once. "Hiroshi, you should not have come so far," she whispered, the words weaving into his mind like a spell. Then, as if the forest itself were responding to her will, the objects around him began to move. A cup slid across the table by itself. A chair tipped over, spinning slowly, and the shadows of the bamboo stretched long and jagged, reaching toward him as though alive. Hiroshi's heart raced, his mind struggling to reconcile the beauty of the widow with the impossible reality before him. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every fiber of his being wanted to stay, drawn by a fascination that was almost unbearable. Finally, the full horror revealed itself. The soft, sorrowful woman he had loved appeared to flicker, her form unraveling like fragile paper. Hollow eyes, lips tinged blue, skin translucent and delicate, and behind her the forest floor seemed to open, revealing moss-covered graves that pulsed faintly in the moonlight. Hiroshi understood in that instant that the widow's home was not a home at all. It was a tomb, a place between life and death, and he had been walking willingly into it. The realization hit him like ice, twisting fear and desire into a single, unbearable truth. The woman he adored was not of the living world, and the forest was ready to claim him as it had claimed countless others before. Frozen and trembling, Hiroshi stared as her hollow gaze met his, the whisper of the bamboo growing louder, surrounding him, enveloping him, and he felt the first real pull of the forest, dragging him toward a fate he could no longer avoid. Hiroshi sank to the forest floor, the moss cold beneath him, struggling to catch his breath as the moonlight revealed the truth he had long suspected but could not fully face. The widow's soft, sorrowful beauty, the shimmering house, the lure of the bamboo paths, they were all illusions, carefully woven by a spirit bound to grief and death. Her sorrow was real, yet it was anchored to the world in a way that pulled life from those who lingered too close. Every night he had felt his strength waning, his body growing pale and frail, and now he understood why. The forest was not merely a backdrop for her mourning, it was a trap, a tethered realm where the living and the dead could brush against each other, but only one could remain unchanged. The hollow eyes that had so terrified him were a window into her nature, a reflection of the centuries of loss and longing that bound her to the forest. She had not invited him to a home, but to a tomb, a place where the boundary between life and death blurred, and where the living could be consumed without a trace. Each step he had taken deeper into the bamboo had brought him closer to her, closer to the inevitability of becoming part of the very world he had admired. The illness that had crept through his body, the weakness in his limbs, the pallor overtaking his skin, it had all been a warning he had ignored, a slow siphoning of vitality by the unseen threads that tied the widow to her sorrow. Yet, in this revelation, Hiroshi also felt a strange clarity. The fear, the fascination, and even the pull of desire were no longer mysteries. The widow's allure had been a mask, a combination of grief and supernatural intent, and the forest itself had been her accomplice, bending reality to ensure that no one left unchanged. Her beauty, her soft voice, the shimmering house, they were all elements of the spell, a lure that revealed both the tenderness and the danger of crossing into her world. Hiroshi realized that he could not undo what had happened, nor could he fully escape the forest's influence. But understanding, even partial, reframed his terror into something he could acknowledge. The woman he loved was not of the living, and the forest had been feeding on him all along, drawing him into a web that had no clear end. The revelation did not make the danger disappear, it made it unmistakable, undeniable. He could see now that every step, every whispered word, every shadow that had moved unnaturally around him had been part of a design far older and more relentless than any human intention. In that moment, Hiroshi understood that the forest and its widow were not cruel by accident. They were eternal, patient, and insistent, and he had been caught in their tide. Knowledge brought no comfort, only a stark, chilling clarity. The deeper he had gone, the closer he had come to becoming part of a world that was not meant for him, a fate he could neither fully escape nor fully comprehend. Hiroshi scrambled backward through the bamboo forest, the mist curling around him like cold fingers, the moonlight flickering across the swaying stalks. His heart pounded, every step heavier than the last, as though the forest itself resisted his escape. Behind him, the soft rustle of bamboo whispered in cadence with the hollow echoes of the widow's presence. He dared not look back, though a part of him longed to see her one last time, to understand what he had truly been drawn into. When he finally stumbled out of the densest grove, the moonlight hit the edge of the village, and for a fleeting moment he felt relief, a fragile sense of safety. Yet the memory of her, hollow eyes, the faint blue of her lips, and the fragile translucence of her skin lingered, twisting in his mind. The forest had shown him a glimpse of its secret, but not the full truth. The woman he had loved and feared was not merely a widow, nor a victim of grief. She was something older, something that had existed beyond the reach of life and death, waiting patiently for someone to follow her into the shadows. Hiroshi's body trembled, weakened beyond reason, yet his mind could not let go of the question that haunted him. Had he truly seen her as she was, or had the forest, with all its whispers and illusions, shown him only a fragment of the truth? And as he reached the first lantern-lit street, the faint scent of moss and cherry blossoms lingered in the cool night air. He froze, breath-catching, because for a single heartbeat, he swore he felt her there just beyond the edge of perception, watching, waiting, and patient as ever. The forest had not released him, and the widow's secret remained, unanswered, eternal, and inescapable. I hope you liked the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. If you'd like to sponsor my coffees for those nights, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, you don't have to. I truly enjoy making these videos for you. But if you'd like to, there's a link below the video. Oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know that next week I will be uploading a new video every day. All Asian horror, based on truly happened stories. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.